He accepted an Apache slave, without knowing she was the chief's daughter. Living on the outskirts of the small frontier town of Red Willow, he woke each day to the same sight of golden sunlight spilling across the hills and the soft sound of the river flowing nearby. Life on the edge of the wilderness was quiet, and most of the settlers preferred it that way. Yet Thomas had never been content with the ordinary. He had a kind heart, one that often led him into situations others would avoid. One early morning, as the mist hovered over the fields, Thomas noticed an unusual commotion near the town square. A small group of settlers was gathered, murmuring and pointing toward the east road. Curiosity tugged at him, and he left his cabin to see what had caused the stir. As he approached, he saw a group of men escorting several prisoners. They were Apache captives, brought in after a minor skirmish near the river. Among them was a young woman, standing tall despite the fatigue and chains that bound her wrists. Her presence struck Thomas immediately. She had a quiet strength about her, a calmness that seemed almost unnatural in such a tense situation. Her dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a kind of dignity that made Thomas pause. The townspeople whispered warnings about the dangers of interacting with the prisoners. "They are enemies," one man said harshly. "Best not to get involved." But Thomas felt an unexpected pull. Something inside him urged him to act differently. After the prisoners were secured, Thomas stayed behind while the others left. He watched the young woman carefully, noting how she neither begged nor pleaded. She seemed calm, almost defiant, yet there was a sadness in her eyes. Thomas knew he could not simply ignore her. The thought of leaving someone in chains, even an enemy, went against everything he believed in. He approached her cautiously, speaking softly. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The woman looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She didn't speak, but her eyes studied him carefully. Thomas understood her silence as a form of assessment. She was trying to understand if he was friend or foe. He held out his hand, not to touch her but as a gesture of peace. After a long pause, she nodded slightly, a small gesture that told him she might trust him enough to follow him. Without thinking much about the consequences, Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives. He went to the town council and asked if he could take the young woman into his care. The council members were surprised. Some frowned. "Why would you do that?" one of them asked. "She is our enemy, it is not safe." Thomas simply replied, "Because it is the right thing to do. She is not a threat to me, and she deserves compassion." After much debate, they reluctantly agreed, warning him to be cautious and reminding him that tensions could rise if the Apache found out she was in town. Thomas prepared a small room in his cabin for her. He cleaned the floor, laid out blankets, and even managed to find a small wooden stool for her to sit on. When he finally led her to the cabin, she did not speak a word. She walked in with measured steps, her eyes still scanning every corner, every shadow, as if she were trying to understand this new environment. Thomas offered her food, simple bread and fresh water, but she hesitated before taking it. He understood her hesitation. Trust was something earned, not freely given. Over the next few days, Thomas did his best to make her comfortable. He spoke to her gently, describing the small town, the river, and the hills beyond. He showed her the garden where he grew vegetables, and slowly she began to relax, observing the world with cautious interest. Thomas decided to call her Nayeli, a name that meant "I love you" in a language he had read about in old books. She did not object, and over time, the name became their small bridge between two very different worlds. Life in the cabin was quiet, yet each moment was filled with small discoveries. Thomas learned that Nayeli was incredibly intelligent, noticing details he had never paid attention to. She pointed out changes in the weather, the patterns of birds, and even the subtle tracks of animals near the river. Thomas found himself admiring her more with each passing day. Despite being a captive, She carried herself with a grace and dignity that made him question everything he thought he knew about courage and resilience. At night, Thomas would often sit by the fireplace, listening to the wind whistle through the trees, while Naomi sat across from him, quietly observing him. They did not need many words to communicate. A shared look, a slight smile, or a gentle gesture became enough. Thomas began to feel a connection that went beyond mere curiosity or sympathy. He realized that compassion could be a powerful bond, one that could transcend fear and misunderstanding. Yet, even in these peaceful moments, Thomas could not ignore the tension in the town. Rumors had already begun to circulate about his decision to shelter an Apache prisoner. Some townsfolk muttered about potential danger, others about his unusual kindness. Thomas did not care much for gossip, but he knew that the path he had chosen was not without risk. Still, he remained determined. Naomi's presence had awakened something in him, a deeper understanding of humanity, of kindness, and of trust. Meanwhile, Naomi began to observe Thomas more closely. She saw the small acts of kindness, the careful way he handled every task, and the genuine concern in his eyes. Slowly, she began to trust him. One morning, she finally spoke a few words in halting English, asking for water. Thomas smiled, pouring it into a cup, and felt a quiet joy in the simplicity of her request. It was the first sign that their bond was growing stronger, that walls of fear and misunderstanding were starting to crumble. Days turned into weeks, and their routine solidified. Thomas would go about his work, repairing fences and tending the garden, while Naomi helped in small ways, quietly observing, learning, and adapting. Though they came from different worlds, an unspoken understanding developed between them. Thomas respected her intelligence, her independence, and her strength, while Naomi began to appreciate the kindness and patience that Thomas showed her. Despite the calm in the cabin, Thomas remained aware of the larger world outside. The Apache people were still near, and tensions between the settlers and the tribe were fragile. One wrong move could ignite conflict. Yet, he also knew that trust and compassion could sometimes prevent disaster. He hoped that by showing kindness to Naomi, he was not only helping her but perhaps planting a seed of understanding between two very different communities. As the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas and Naomi sat quietly by the window. Thomas glanced at her, noticing how her eyes reflected the fading light. He felt a strange sense of peace, tempered by the knowledge that their story was only beginning. There were challenges ahead, dangers they could not yet foresee, and truths that had yet to be revealed. But for now, in that quiet moment, they shared a fragile bond built on trust, compassion, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes kindness was the bravest choice of all. And so, the first chapter of their story unfolded, not with fireworks or battles, but with quiet courage, the kind that changes hearts slowly and sets the stage for an extraordinary journey that neither of them could have imagined. Days passed in a quiet rhythm, but Thomas could sense that their peaceful routine was only temporary. Life on the edge of the wilderness was never predictable, and he knew that the world outside his small cabin held dangers and challenges he could not control. Still, he remained committed to caring for Naomi. She had grown accustomed to the cabin, moving with cautious confidence, yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes that told Thomas she was always aware of the world beyond his walls. Thomas decided that he wanted Naomi to feel some sense of normalcy, despite the circumstances. Each morning he brought her fresh water from the river and small bowls of food, carefully prepared. Sometimes he would speak to her about everyday life, how the town functioned, the rhythm of the seasons, and even small stories of his childhood. At first she only listened, her face unreadable, but gradually she began to respond, speaking a few words of English she had learned from distant travelers. Her voice was soft, but it carried determination. The bond between them started growing in small, quiet ways. Thomas noticed how she paid attention to details he had long overlooked. She would point out signs of approaching storms, notice tracks of wild animals near the cabin, or observe subtle changes in the river's current. Thomas admired her intelligence and adaptability. It was as though she could read the land with an instinct that went far beyond ordinary observation. Sometimes, he caught himself marveling at her calmness in a world where most would panic. Yet, trust was still fragile. Naomi remained cautious, never revealing too much about herself, her family, or her life before capture. Thomas respected her silence, understanding that trauma could not be spoken away. Instead, he tried to communicate through actions, showing patience, kindness, and respect. When he noticed her tired from the long days, he would allow her to rest. When she hesitated to take food, he waited, never forcing her. Slowly, she began to accept the gestures, small proofs that she could rely on him. Outside the cabin, life in the settlement continued, and Thomas could not ignore the whispers that reached his ears. Some townsfolk disapproved of his decision to harbor an Apache captive. "Why are you feeding our enemy?" one man asked sharply during the town gathering. "You are inviting trouble." Thomas listened but did not argue. He knew that fear often spoke louder than reason. He believed that actions, not words, would prove the value of his choices. Meanwhile, Naomi was observing Thomas too. She saw the care he put into preparing food, the careful way he maintained his cabin, and the respect he showed to others. Unlike the settlers who had treated her people as enemies, Thomas treated her as an individual, not a symbol of conflict. Slowly, a sense of trust grew within her. One day, when Thomas was repairing a small fence near the cabin, Naomi approached him and offered to help. It was a small gesture, but it marked a turning point in their relationship. Thomas smiled warmly, grateful for the silent trust she was beginning to place in him. The days that followed were filled with small routines that slowly wove a sense of stability into their lives. Thomas taught Naomi simple tasks, tending to the garden, collecting water, and caring for a few animals he had kept. Naomi proved to be quick to learn, performing each task with care and attention. She did not speak much, but her actions communicated respect and willingness. Thomas found joy in these simple moments, realizing that trust could grow quietly, almost invisibly, in shared work and daily life. Despite this progress, Thomas remained cautious. He understood that the world outside his cabin could be harsh and unforgiving. There were dangers he could not control: Apache warriors who might search for their missing member, or settlers who might act out of fear and prejudice. He often stayed awake late into the night, thinking about possible scenarios and how to protect Naomi. Yet each time he looked at her calm, steady presence, he felt a renewed sense of hope. One afternoon, Thomas decided to take Naomi outside the cabin for the first time. They walked slowly toward the edge of the river, moving carefully to avoid attracting attention. Naomi's eyes widened as she took in the flowing water, the birds, and the trees. For a moment, Thomas felt as if she were seeing the world for the first time, and he realized that her life before captivity must have been very different. He watched her carefully, ready to react if fear or danger appeared, but she seemed at ease, quietly observing the landscape with a kind of curiosity and wonder that touched him deeply. As the days turned into weeks, the connection between Thomas and Naomi strengthened. They developed a rhythm, a silent understanding that did not require many words. Sometimes they worked side by side in the garden, other times they sat quietly by the fire, simply sharing the warmth of each other's presence. Thomas began to appreciate the depth of her character. She was patient, thoughtful, and remarkably strong, even in the face of fear and uncertainty. Naomi, in turn, began to see Thomas not just as a caretaker, but as a person she could trust, someone who treated her with dignity and respect. Life, however, remained unpredictable. One evening, as Thomas prepared a simple meal, Nayeli suddenly stiffened. Her eyes were fixed on the distant hills, alert and watchful. Thomas followed her gaze and saw a small group of figures moving through the trees. His heart raced. Could they be Apache warriors? Or perhaps settlers who had grown suspicious of her presence? Thomas quietly signaled for Nayeli to stay calm and move to observe. After a tense few moments, the figures passed without incident, disappearing into the forest. Thomas exhaled slowly, realizing that their peaceful routine was always under threat, yet grateful that no harm had come that day. In the following days, Thomas noticed subtle changes in Nayeli's behavior. She became more engaged in the tasks around the cabin, more willing to speak small words, and occasionally even offered suggestions about how to manage the household. Thomas listened carefully, valuing her insights. He realized that their relationship was evolving, not just as caretaker and captive, but as two individuals learning to understand and trust each other. One morning, Thomas decided to share a story from his childhood. He spoke of his first hunting trip, his first encounter with a storm on the hills, and the lessons he had learned from his father about kindness and courage. Nayeli listened quietly, occasionally nodding or glancing up with interest. She did not speak much, but Thomas felt that she was absorbing his words, thinking deeply about their meaning. In that moment, he understood that stories could bridge worlds, that sharing experiences could create understanding even when language and culture were different. As the sun set each evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Thomas and Nayeli often sat together by the fire. Thomas would sometimes ask her questions, simple ones about her past or her observations of the land. Nayeli's responses were brief but thoughtful, revealing flashes of wisdom and insight. Each day, the bond between them grew stronger, built not on force or obligation, but on mutual respect, trust, and the small acts of kindness that made their shared life possible. Though their days were filled with quiet routines, Thomas knew that the outside world remained uncertain. He often thought about the Apache people who might come searching for Nayeli, about the townsfolk who might act out of fear or prejudice, and about the delicate balance he had created by offering her shelter. Yet, he also believed that trust and compassion could overcome fear. Every small act of care, every moment of understanding, was a step toward something larger, a connection that could transcend fear, misunderstanding, and division. And so, life continued in the cabin, marked by quiet courage and growing trust. Thomas and Nayeli shared small victories each day, moments of understanding, laughter, and discovery. Their bond was becoming something extraordinary, a symbol of hope and humanity in a world often divided by fear and conflict. Each day brought challenges and uncertainty, but also the promise of growth, learning, and the beginning of a journey that neither of them could have imagined when their paths first crossed. By the end of this part of their story, Thomas and Nayeli were no longer merely caretaker and captive. They were companions, cautiously learning to navigate the fragile bridge of trust between them. And though the future remained unknown, each passing day strengthened the foundation of their relationship, preparing them for the trials, revelations, and transformations that lay ahead. As the days turned into weeks, the quiet routine in Thomas's cabin began to face challenges. Beyond their small world, while Thomas and Nayeli had grown closer, the town itself was becoming restless. Rumors had started to circulate, some true, some exaggerated, about the young Apache woman staying in Thomas's care. Whispers traveled quickly through the settlement. People questioned his judgment, worried about potential danger, and some even openly criticized him. "They say he keeps one of their women in his cabin," muttered a farmer to his neighbor as they worked in the fields. "Is he mad? Who knows what trouble he might bring?" Thomas heard these murmurs but chose not to confront them. He understood that fear often made people suspicious of what they did not understand. Instead, he focused on his work, and on creating a safe environment for Naeli. He believed that actions could speak louder than words. His calmness and patience were tested constantly, but he refused to let rumors dictate his choices. Naeli, too, had begun to sense the tension. She noticed the suspicious glances from the townsfolk and the occasional whispered warnings from visitors to the cabin. Though she could not fully understand all the human politics at play, she was keenly aware of the potential danger. One afternoon, while Thomas worked on repairing a fence, Naeli quietly whispered, "They watch." Her words were simple, but the tone carried weight. Thomas paused, looking around. Sure enough, a few men had paused at the edge of the property, staring cautiously before moving along. Despite the underlying tension, Thomas and Naeli continued to build their trust. Each day brought new opportunities for learning and connection. Thomas would teach her about plants in the garden, explaining which vegetables could grow in different seasons and how to tend them carefully. Naeli, in turn, would show an unexpected knowledge of the land, pointing out patterns in the soil and signs in the river that Thomas had never noticed. Their partnership, though quiet and subtle, was beginning to resemble a shared understanding of the world around them. Yet the real test came when a stranger arrived in the settlement. He was a trader from a nearby town, a man who claimed to know the Apache and their ways. His presence sparked immediate concern among the townsfolk. Some whispered that he might bring news of an Apache attack, while others feared he would expose Naeli's presence to her people. Thomas welcomed the trader politely, hiding his own anxiety. Naeli, meanwhile, watched quietly from the corner of the cabin, her dark eyes alert and watchful. The trader was curious about Naeli, asking questions about her origins and her past. Thomas tried to shield her, giving minimal answers and steering the conversation away from sensitive topics. Naeli, though reserved, noticed the trader's interest and stiffened slightly. She had learned quickly to read human behavior, and his questions made her wary. For the first time, Thomas saw her hesitation turn into a quiet resolve. She was no longer simply a passive observer. She was aware, cautious, and prepared to respond if necessary. Life in the cabin continued under this careful balance. Thomas maintained his daily routines, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and ensuring that Naeli felt safe. Naeli, in turn, began to contribute more actively, preparing simple meals, helping with chores, and even attempting to learn some of the English words that Thomas used frequently. Though communication was still limited, they discovered ways to understand each other, whether through gestures, shared tasks, or the occasional spoken word. One day, a small group of children from the settlement approached the cabin. They had heard the whispers about Naeli and were curious. Thomas was cautious but allowed them to observe from a distance. Naeli, despite her initial apprehension, did not retreat. Instead, she watched them silently, her calm demeanor piquing their interest. Over time, some of the children began to interact with her, asking questions and laughing at her tentative attempts at their language. Thomas watched with a mixture of pride and relief. These small interactions were beginning to build bridges, showing that fear could be replaced with curiosity and understanding. However, not all interactions were peaceful. One evening, a group of young men from the town approached the cabin with hostile intent. They had heard exaggerated stories about Naeli and came to confront Thomas, demanding that he release her. Thomas, anticipating trouble, met them calmly outside. "She is under my protection," he said firmly. "I will not allow harm to come to her." The young men scoffed. "She is one of them," one shouted. "You are putting the town at risk." Thomas stood his ground, unafraid. "She is a person, not a threat," he replied. "Your fear blinds you to what is right. I will not act out of fear, and I expect the same from you." Naeli observed quietly from the cabin doorway. She did not intervene, yet Thomas could see her eyes filled with a mixture of respect and gratitude. She had learned that he was willing to risk his own safety to protect her, and this realization deepened her trust. As the confrontation ended without violence, Thomas and Naeli retreated to the cabin. That night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas reflected on the growing challenges of their situation. The outside world was unpredictable, filled with fear, prejudice, and uncertainty. Yet the bond they shared had grown stronger. Naeli, once silent and guarded, now offered small gestures of communication and understanding. They had survived their first serious test together, and Thomas knew that more challenges lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, Thomas noticed subtle changes in Naeli's behavior. She became more confident, offering suggestions and taking initiative in daily tasks. She began to smile occasionally, a small but significant sign of her growing comfort. Thomas, in turn, became more attentive, recognizing her strength and intelligence. Their relationship was evolving beyond caretaker and captive. They were becoming true companions, united by trust, respect, and shared experiences. Yet the tension from the town continued to simmer. Some settlers grew increasingly suspicious, watching Thomas's every move. They whispered about the potential danger, wondering if the Apache would retaliate for Naeli's capture. Thomas ignored most of the gossip, focusing instead on protecting Naeli and maintaining a sense of normalcy. He understood that fear often led people to make hasty judgments, and he was determined not to let it influence his actions. One afternoon, Thomas decided to teach Naeli a new skill: how to track small animals in the forest. He wanted her to understand the signs of nature, to read the land with the same skill he used in his daily life. Naeli followed him carefully, observing the tracks and patterns he pointed out. Her natural intelligence and awareness became evident as she quickly grasped the techniques, asking questions and pointing out details Thomas had missed. For the first time, he realized that her knowledge of the land might even surpass his own in certain ways. During these lessons, Thomas and Naeli shared quiet conversations, exchanging simple words and gestures. Naeli spoke slowly, carefully choosing her words. Thomas listened attentively, encouraging her to express herself. These moments became a bridge between their worlds, allowing them to communicate not just through actions, but through shared understanding and thought. As the sun set over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Thomas reflected on the journey they had taken together. From the day he first saw Naeli among the captives, to the moments of quiet trust and understanding, their bond had grown stronger with each passing day. He knew that the challenges ahead would test them further, but he also knew that the foundation they had built, trust, respect, and shared courage, would help them face whatever came next. Meanwhile, Naeli continued to observe the town and the people around her. She had begun to understand the complexities of human behavior, noticing who could be trusted and who could not. Her respect for Thomas grew with each day, as she realized that he treated her not as a prisoner, but as a human being worthy of dignity and care. She was beginning to feel something she had not felt in a long time: safety and even hope. Life remained tense but full of quiet victories. Every small gesture, every shared smile, every moment of understanding was a step toward bridging two worlds that had often been at odds. Thomas and Naeli had begun to create a new story, one not defined by fear or prejudice, but by trust, courage, and the willingness to see the humanity in each other. And so, as the nights grew longer and the wind whispered through the trees, Thomas and Naeli prepared themselves for the days ahead. Challenges would come, as they always did on the edge of the wilderness. But together, they had discovered that trust could overcome fear, that kindness could defy suspicion, and that even in a world filled with tension, two people could build a bridge strong enough to connect hearts across cultures, languages, and history. By the end of this part, Thomas and Naeli were no longer simply caretaker and captive, nor were they mere allies. They had become companions, navigating the complexities of a world that often misunderstood them. Their story was growing richer, more intricate, and filled with the promise of trust and understanding, a promise that would carry them through the trials yet to come. The peaceful rhythm that Thomas and Nayeli had built was suddenly interrupted one early morning. Thomas had woken before dawn, as was his habit, to tend to the garden and check on the animals. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and earth. The soft light of sunrise painted the hills in shades of gold and pink. Thomas felt a strange tension in the air, though he could not immediately identify its source. Nayeli, too, seemed unusually alert. She had been restless through the night, listening intently to the distant sounds of the forest. Something in her expression suggested that she was sensing a presence beyond the ordinary. Thomas noticed the change and quietly asked, "Do you hear something?" She shook her head slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her silence spoke volumes. Thomas knew she was aware of something important, something he might not yet understand. Together they waited in the soft light, watching and listening. Then, through the morning mist, a group of figures appeared on the hilltop, moving with careful precision. They were Apache warriors, mounted on strong horses, and they were coming toward the settlement. Thomas's heart sank. He had always known this moment could come, but seeing it in reality brought a rush of fear he could not hide. Nayeli, however, remained calm, though her hands gripped the edge of the cabin window tightly. Thomas understood immediately that these were not ordinary visitors. They were seeking something or someone. His mind raced through possible scenarios. Could they be coming for her? For revenge? Or was there some other purpose behind their approach? As the warriors drew closer, Thomas stepped outside, standing tall to greet them. Nayeli stayed behind, watching silently. When the group arrived at the edge of the settlement, the leader dismounted, a man whose presence commanded respect. Nayeli's eyes widened in recognition, and Thomas realized with a sudden jolt that this man was not just any Apache warrior. He was her father, the chief, a figure of authority and power among his people. Thomas felt a mix of fear, guilt, and awe. He had unknowingly sheltered the daughter of the Apache chief. All the time he had spent caring for her, building trust, and protecting her had led to this moment of revelation. He wondered how the chief would react. Would he be angry, seeking retribution for Nayeli's capture? Or would he understand that Thomas's intentions had been pure? The chief approached Thomas slowly, his eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was almost tangible. Nayeli emerged from the cabin at that moment, standing between Thomas and her father. There was no fear in her posture, only calm determination. She looked at her father, then at Thomas, and spoke softly in her native language. Thomas did not understand the words, but the tone was urgent yet respectful. The chief's eyes softened slightly as he listened to her. Thomas could see the change in expression, the first hint that Nayeli's words were having an effect. Then she turned to him and gestured as if to say, "Explain yourself." Thomas swallowed hard and began to speak, carefully choosing his words. He told the chief about the day he had first seen Nayeli among the captives, how he had offered her shelter out of compassion, and how he had treated her with respect and care. He spoke honestly, describing their growing trust and the bond they had developed over the weeks. He admitted that he had been unaware of her identity, but insisted that his actions had been guided by kindness and integrity. Throughout his explanation, Nayeli stood silently, occasionally nodding, reinforcing his words with her presence. The chief listened carefully, his expression unreadable. Thomas felt the weight of every second as he awaited judgment. He knew that one wrong word, one misstep, could change everything. Yet he also felt a strange sense of calm, bolstered by the trust he and Nayeli had built. He hoped that their bond could speak louder than fear or anger. After a long pause, the chief finally spoke, his voice deep and commanding. He asked Nayeli questions about her experiences, her feelings, and her impressions of Thomas. Nayeli responded carefully, describing how Thomas had treated her not as a prisoner, but as a human being worthy of respect and dignity. She explained that he had kept her safe, provided food and shelter, and allowed her to make choices freely. Thomas watched in awe as her words seemed to shift the atmosphere. The chief's eyes softened further, and he began to nod slowly. Naeli's description of Thomas's character and integrity had made an impression. The chief realized that Thomas's intentions had been pure and that he had acted with courage and honor, even in the face of potential danger. Then, the chief turned to Thomas directly. "You have shown respect to my daughter," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You have risked your own safety to protect her. That is not an action taken lightly. I will not punish you for what has happened, but know this, you must continue to honor her and keep her safe." Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. He bowed slightly, acknowledging the chief's authority and expressing his commitment to protect Naeli. Naeli stepped closer to her father, placing a hand lightly on his arm, as if to emphasize her own trust in Thomas. The chief studied both of them carefully, then finally nodded, signaling that, for now, their arrangement would continue. Over the following days, the presence of the chief and his warriors brought a new dynamic to the settlement. The townsfolk, who had already been wary of Naeli's presence, observed the interactions with cautious curiosity. Thomas remained vigilant, understanding that trust had been established, but tensions could still arise. Naeli, however, seemed at ease, walking confidently among the warriors and engaging with her father in quiet conversation. Thomas and Naeli's bond had been tested in ways neither could have anticipated. The revelation of her identity had brought fear, uncertainty, and potential conflict, yet it had also strengthened their trust. Thomas realized that their relationship was no longer just about caretaker and captive. It had become a partnership built on mutual respect, courage, and understanding. During this period, Thomas also began to learn more about the Apache people, their customs, and their values. He observed their respect for the land, their careful attention to the patterns of nature, and their strong sense of family and community. Naeli guided him through these lessons, explaining customs and traditions, often using gestures and simple words. Thomas marveled at the depth of her knowledge and the wisdom she carried, even at such a young age. The chief, too, grew to respect Thomas further. He observed the way Thomas treated Naeli, how he maintained honesty, courage, and patience. Slowly, he began to see Thomas not as an outsider, but as someone capable of understanding and honoring the values of the Apache people. Naeli's trust in Thomas had bridged the gap, creating a connection that transcended culture, language, and past conflicts. Yet, even with the chief's approval, the future remained uncertain. Thomas knew that the outside world, other settlers, rival groups, and unpredictable circumstances could still challenge their fragile peace. But for the first time, he felt that their efforts, their trust, and their courage had created a foundation strong enough to withstand these pressures. He understood that true bravery was not only about facing danger, but also about acting with integrity, compassion, and respect. Naeli, too, felt a sense of relief and empowerment. She had been uncertain and cautious when she first arrived at Thomas's cabin, but now she could see that trust and understanding could exist even between worlds that had long been in conflict. She began to speak more freely, offering insights, guidance, and even gentle advice to Thomas. Their partnership had become a blend of trust, mutual respect, and shared responsibility, a rare bond that neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. Life in the cabin returned to a careful rhythm. Thomas continued his daily tasks, tending the garden, maintaining the animals, and preparing food. Naeli assisted him, offering suggestions and demonstrating a growing confidence in her abilities. The chief and his warriors remained nearby, their presence a reminder of the delicate balance that had been established. Yet, within the cabin, there was a sense of calm and stability, built on trust, courage, and the recognition of shared humanity. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, Thomas and Naeli sat together outside the cabin. The sky was painted in brilliant hues of orange and purple, reflecting in the quiet river. Thomas glanced at Naeli and saw a mixture of strength, intelligence, and calm determination in her eyes. He realized that their journey was far from over, but he also understood that they had weathered the most significant storm, the revelation of her identity, and had emerged stronger together. The chief approached quietly, sitting nearby without a word. Thomas observed the interaction between father and daughter, noting the deep respect and understanding that passed between them. Naeli smiled softly at her father, then turned to Thomas, offering a small gesture of reassurance. Thomas nodded in return, grateful for the trust that had been placed in him and determined to honor it. By the end of this part of their story, Thomas and Naeli had faced one of their greatest challenges. The revelation of her identity had tested their trust, courage, and integrity, yet it had also strengthened the bond between them. They had learned that understanding, respect, and honesty could overcome fear, suspicion, and cultural barriers. Their journey was far from complete, but the foundation they had built would guide them through the challenges yet to come. Life, after the revelation of Naeli's identity, brought both relief and new responsibilities. Thomas had survived the test of trust, and Naeli's father, the chief, had come to recognize his integrity and courage. Yet, Thomas knew that their journey was far from over. The wilderness and the settlement still posed dangers, and the delicate balance of trust they had achieved could be disrupted at any moment. Still, within the cabin, a sense of purpose and unity had begun to grow, a quiet strength born from their shared experiences. Thomas continued his daily routines with renewed focus. Each morning he rose with the sun, tending to the garden, feeding the animals, and checking the fences. Naeli followed, her steps confident and precise. She had learned much from Thomas about the settlement, its customs, and its way of life, but she had also taught him lessons about the land, survival, and patience. Their partnership had evolved into something remarkable: mutual respect, trust, and understanding that transcended words. The chief remained nearby, observing silently and occasionally offering guidance. He respected Thomas for keeping his daughter safe, but he also reminded him of the responsibilities that came with trust. "Protect her as you would protect the land," the chief advised one morning, his deep voice carrying wisdom that Thomas felt in his bones. Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of the request. He was no longer simply a settler living his own life. He was a guardian, a bridge between two worlds. Naeli, too, grew more confident with each passing day. She moved freely around the settlement, her presence no longer just tolerated but quietly respected. Some settlers, who had once been wary or suspicious, began to recognize her intelligence and composure. Children approached her with curiosity, and even adults who had doubted Thomas's judgment started to observe her with a cautious admiration. Naeli, for her part, remained humble and careful, always aware of the boundaries she had to navigate. One afternoon, Thomas and Naeli decided to walk along the river, a place that had become a sanctuary for both of them. The river flowed steadily, reflecting the bright sky above, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and wildflowers. Naeli moved gracefully along the riverbank, occasionally pausing to observe the tracks of animals or the patterns in the water. Thomas watched her with quiet admiration, realizing that she had not only survived great trials but had also maintained a dignity and strength that was extraordinary. As they walked, Thomas spoke gently about the future. "We have come far," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But the world outside still has challenges. People may not understand us, or they may fear what they do not know. We must be careful, but we must also continue to do what is right." Naeli nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Though her English was limited, the meaning was clear. Trust, courage, and integrity were not just ideas, they were guiding principles for their lives. Over the following weeks, Thomas and Nayeli worked together to strengthen the bonds between the settlement and the Apache community. Nayeli's father, the chief, encouraged cautious interactions, allowing her to engage with the settlers under his watchful eye. Slowly, walls of suspicion began to crumble. Small acts of kindness, shared labor, and simple conversations began to bridge the gap between two worlds that had long been divided by fear and misunderstanding. Thomas often reflected on how far they had come. When he first saw Nayeli among the captives, he had acted purely out of instinct and compassion. He had not known her identity, and he had risked his own safety to help her. Now, after weeks of trust building, shared experiences, and challenges overcome, their bond had become a testament to the power of empathy and understanding. He realized that courage was not just about facing danger, it was about acting with integrity, even when the consequences were unknown. Nayeli, too, recognized the changes within herself. She had arrived at the settlement wary, cautious, and silent, unsure of who she could trust. Through her time with Thomas, she had learned that trust could be earned and that not all humans sought harm. She had discovered the meaning of compassion, patience, and partnership. Her confidence had grown, and she began to offer guidance not just to Thomas, but also to her father and the warriors who remained nearby. Her voice, once quiet and hesitant, now carried wisdom and clarity. Despite the growing trust and understanding, Thomas and Nayeli remained aware of the delicate balance they had created. Danger was never far away. The wilderness could be unpredictable, rival settlers could act out of fear, and misunderstandings could arise at any moment. Yet, rather than allowing fear to dominate their lives, they focused on the bonds they had built. Each day was an opportunity to strengthen trust, to learn from each other, and to show courage in both action and character. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas and Nayeli sat quietly outside the cabin. The sky glowed in shades of orange, pink, and purple, and the river reflected the colors like a mirror. Thomas looked at Nayeli and saw not just the young woman he had sheltered, but a companion, a guide, and a partner. Nayeli met his gaze and smiled softly, a gesture filled with understanding and mutual respect. In that moment, words were unnecessary. Their shared experiences had spoken louder than anything they could say. The chief approached them silently, his presence commanding yet gentle. He had observed their relationship from the beginning, watching how trust and respect had grown. Now he saw the bond fully realized, a connection that had endured trials, uncertainty, and the unknown. He spoke quietly to Thomas, his voice carrying both authority and warmth. "You have honored my daughter and acted with integrity. That is rare. Your actions have shown that understanding and respect can bridge even the widest gaps." Thomas bowed slightly, humbled by the chief's words. "I only did what I believed was right," he replied. She deserved respect and safety, nothing more. Nayeli reached out and placed a hand on her father's arm, a silent gesture of affirmation and trust. The chief smiled faintly, recognizing that his daughter had found not only safety but also partnership and friendship in Thomas. Life gradually returned to a new normal. The settlement accepted Nayeli's presence more openly, and small acts of cooperation between the settlers and the Apache became more common. Thomas continued his work, both in the cabin and in the fields, while Nayeli engaged with her father's people, learning and teaching, guiding and observing. Their relationship had become a model of trust and mutual respect, demonstrating that understanding and empathy could overcome even the deepest divisions. Over time, Thomas reflected on the lessons he had learned. He realized that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, and consistent. Compassion could create bridges where fear had built walls, and integrity could earn trust in the most unlikely circumstances. Nayeli had shown him that strength could come from observation, thoughtfulness, and careful action. Together, they had built something remarkable, a partnership that respected both their worlds and forged a new path forward. Nayeli, too, understood the transformation that had occurred within her. She had arrived as a captive, uncertain of who she could trust or what her future held. Through patience, observation, and gradual acceptance, she had discovered safety, trust, and friendship. She had learned that not all humans sought harm, that understanding and empathy could flourish even in the face of fear, and that courage was measured not just in physical strength, but in the willingness to act with integrity and compassion. The bond between Thomas and Nayeli became a quiet legend within the settlement and the surrounding Apache community. Their story spread not through grand events, but through the small, meaningful acts that defined their lives. People began to see that trust, respect, and understanding could bridge worlds that had long been divided. Children learned from Nayeli's example, settlers observed Thomas's integrity, and even the warriors began to respect the quiet strength that had been built between two individuals from different worlds. As the seasons changed, Thomas and Nayeli continued their lives side by side. They worked, learned, and explored together, always mindful of the lessons they had learned about trust, courage, and empathy. Their bond became a living example of what could be achieved when fear was replaced with understanding and when integrity guided every action. The wilderness, the settlement, and the Apache community all bore witness to their story, a story of compassion, respect, and the enduring power of human connection. One quiet evening, Thomas and Nayeli sat together on a small hill overlooking the river. The sky was filled with stars, and the world seemed vast yet intimate, as if all the challenges and fears of the past were now part of a greater tapestry. Thomas turned to Nayeli and said softly, "We have come far, haven't we?" She smiled, nodding, her eyes reflecting the starlight. They did not need words beyond that. The journey they had taken, the trust they had built, and the bond they had formed spoke for itself. By the end of this chapter of their lives, Thomas and Nayeli had achieved something extraordinary. They had faced uncertainty, fear, and revelation, yet had emerged stronger together. Their story was no longer just about shelter or survival. It was about trust, courage, and the remarkable connections that could form between two people who chose to act with integrity and compassion. And so their lives continued, intertwined with the land, the settlement, and the Apache community. Their bond, tested and proven, became a lasting symbol of understanding, a quiet but powerful reminder that even in a world filled with fear and division, trust, kindness, and empathy could light the way forward. Their story would be remembered, not for battles fought or enemies defeated, but for the courage to act rightly, the strength to trust, and the enduring power of human connection.